Okay, so welcome everybody to History Talk. We're going to talk about women of the California Gold Rush. You know me, I'm Mary Volmer. Well, I'm not a member of the church. We'll have to remedy that. I'm
I didn't
actually,
know that.
I didn't,
Well,
I've never joined. So yeah, we'll have to remedy that. Um, but I've offered this for an auction item and hi, come here. Look at this. Come here, come here. Oh, you got to hold it closer.
whoa.
How many goals did you allow, Ojo?
Three
Total, huh?
in 4 games.
In 4 games. I think you're allowed then. Good job. You're tired, huh? Yeah. I need to wash that. That's a mess. Yeah, I'll edit this part out. It's fine. Okay. All right. So I'll also go start. So I have a slide presentation. We can hop in and out. You can ask questions at any time. One of the things about this project, which I began well over 20 years ago, was that very little had been known at that time about women in the gold rush, and certainly women in the West, and a huge interest, scholarly interest in the lives of women and historical figures has blossomed since I began looking at it. So this is a story that begins with the omission of a lot of stories of women's stories. And I'm hoping that by the end, it's kind of a call to action. So this isn't going to be a comprehensive historical lecture by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm hoping it piques your interest enough to start picking around and start looking for the stories that were lost. And maybe it's your grandmother's story, maybe it's an aunt's, maybe it is one of those rambunctious historical figures who feature very small in very small print in a lot of different sources. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully I have it on the right one, which I don't. Okay. I taught a course called Women of the California Gold Rush and learned a lot more about the subject after I had written a book on the subject. so it seems like there's always more to learn. Before we start that, I guess I should just tell you how I got interested in the first place in the topic. I'm not a history major, studied English and biology in college, but when I was living at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth, I was supposed to be giving history talks up and down the Welsh coast on California history, which I knew about as much as your average fourth grader, having gone through that curriculum, and my mom had taught that curriculum. So I had a little familiarity with the material. I certainly had a familiarity with the landscape and the place, having grown up in Grass Valley, which was pretty much the epicenter of Gold Rush history. But I didn't know much, really. And so when I would go around to these Rotary clubs, which were almost exclusively male, and would talk about the dates and the great men and the discoveries, it was underwhelming, to say the least. They were pleasant and polite, but I think we were both underwhelmed with what I was offering them as history, until it was one time, I think it was in Fishguard. It was a ladies' night, so the wives were allowed to come with the men to have dinner. And one of the women said, "Well, what about the women? Were there any women in the gold rush?" And here I was, a athlete, someone who just had begged for the opportunity to play, to be included among the men. And yet I had never thought of the question, what about the women? So I went back to the library and I began searching for records of women in the California Gold Rush, which are at the time were not to be found in any of the popular histories other than a one-line mention here and there. What I did discover, however, was in the letters home and in the journal entries and in marriage reports and in death certificates, there actually was a large percentage. There was a record, but not a historical record, not a record that had been put in the textbooks for me to follow. So I began digging a little bit and looking for the women scholars who were doing this kind of research. And so what I'm going to offer you is just a snapshot of the era, the lives of a few women who are now far more well known than they had been, and then a call to action to kind of dig into whatever historical moment is of interest to you. So the California Gold Rush. I guess I should mention I wrote a novel.
Right.
Out of this material, the first one, Crown of Dust, I think I'm pointing at the right picture over my head, is set during the California Gold Rush. And if we have time, I'll offer you a little section of the story, because in immersing yourself in a time and place, you also immerse yourself in the people. And that's how I really started writing fiction in the first place, was through the study of history. All right, so let's take a look. Here we are, imagining history's lost voices. There are many lost voices in history, and a great percentage of them are women and people of color and indigenous people. I've given this talk a couple times over the course of the last 20 years, and taught a course at St. Mary's Jan term where we just looked at, I had 20 students, and each of them had to dig up and find one person and do historical research on that woman. And the findings were tremendous. Some of what I'll present to you is in fact the research that some of my students have done. So what's happening? We're going to look at Gold Rush history, a really, really quick summary. We'll look at the women who went west. There's a phrase at the time, go west, young man. But joining these young men were a large percentage, much larger than the 8% that were documented, of women coming west to join their husbands, to find husbands, to accompany brothers and that sort of thing. We'll talk about the kind of work women did, and the novelty of being paid for domestic work at a rate that exceeded the rate men were paid for their labors, which is unheard of in the East. And then we'll talk about what you can do next, what you can read next. So snapshot of this moment. You think now is crazy and we're in a moment of complete disruption. Well, back in 1848, the world was a mess. It was a revolution everywhere you look. The European revolutions in Germany, certainly, and throughout the European states, where the feudal systems were being fractured into new governments. You had famine in Ireland that was just decimating the whole population and inciting a mass immigration from that country. You also had war and famine in China, especially in South China. You had in January 1848, a little known event happens in California at Sutter's Mill, and that's John Marshall finds a little bit of gold, a little piece of gold. At the same time, and about 3 days later, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is passed. This ends the Mexican-American War and cedes to the United States a vast chunk of land, including, I'm gonna have to look at my notes, so including California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Just a vast chunk of central and western United States are just signed over to the United States. Now, as you might imagine, news of the gold had not yet reached the East, and certainly hadn't reached Mexico. So had that news had passed quicker, that treaty would have been far more complicated. At the same time, you have these uppity women, the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. So you have a moment of tremendous social and political and economic upheaval all over the world, not just in pieces as we might have assumed, famine. A lot of times when we study history, we study geological regions, but we don't always zoom out to understand what's happening on the globe. And the globalism, which we think is just a phenomenon of our moment, actually, if you follow back, the trends go back farther than you'd imagine. I have a theory about that, but I'll spare you about why. So people came to California. Here's gold that's been discovered. Even rumor of gold is going to make desperate people flock to this promise. So in 1847, there were about 8,000 non-native Californian inhabitants. and not that many at all. In the years between 1848 and 1850, 90,000 people came. 90,000 descended, most of them men, most of them. About a decade later, 400,000 people had immigrated. Now, when I say people, I mean white people, and mostly men. So European, of that number, it's not clear how many people of Chinese and Asian descent were counted as people in part of these censuses, and certainly women, if they were wives, might have been counted, but not if they were prostitutes and not if they were of color. So these numbers are not accurate, and they don't tell a whole story. This the story that is told in Gold, however, even though the numbers are not accurate, is not a story we're often told of the gold rush, the mass genocide that happened as a result of this influx of people looking for gold. And there's more stories that need to be told as a result. Can everybody see that, or do you have a bar like I do at the bottom?
No.
Okay. Okay. A weird bar in mine. Okay, so I mean, huge. Now you have two ways of getting there. You can hitch a wagon from Independence, Missouri. First, you have to get to Independence, Missouri, which means you have to cross the Mississippi River. There are no railroads because the railroads started to be put in place after and during the Civil War, just after the Civil War especially. So you're going by wagon most of the time, or by waterways if you're going to the Mississippi. It's going to take you 3 months traveling by land on several different overland trails. If you're smart, you don't go south, even though it's a faster and less arduous route, because it's through the desert. Very few people are going to survive that route. You might go north and go to Oregon. It's a better route. It's more traveled, but because it's more traveled, there's a lot less grazing land, and you are going to be needing to bring all of your animals, feed all your animals, much less your people. They're not sure how many people actually died along this trip. But they do know that the death rates of men exceeded the death rates of women, and nobody not quite knows why. So I won't speculate, but, or you could go around the Horn. And now at first you could not, there was no Panama Canal. So in order to travel by ship, you were going to have to go all the way around the tip of South America, which is some of the most treacherous water that you can ever sail. Certainly, at the quickest, it would be about 3 months if you made it at all. Most people made it in about 4 to 5 months. So if you're going to say goodbye, Ma, I'll text you when I get there, it's going to be a long, long silence. And this is why they were coming. This is why they went. In the first year alone, $10 million. And I put that in roughly what it would be like today, that money. I think it's more than that now. I think that was about 2 years ago. So my 1860, about $17 billion in gold had been dug out of the California waterways. Most of that was alluvial gold. And when I say that, that means river gold. That means the stereotype of a guy with a pan or a rifle, rifling through the silt looking for gold that was on the surface. Now, if you look at the average daily wage of a laborer in the Erie Canal, it sucks. Yeah. It's 88 cents a day. And you look at what they might make in California, and you say, well, $20 a day, it's ridiculous. It was that promise that brought people west. Nobody cared who your daddy was. Nobody cared whether you had an education or not. The myth was, if you had the capacity to labor, you had the capacity to get rich. That gold rush mentality that I think also we see in Hollywood and certainly in the dot-com boom first caught in California in the 1848s. In 1848, excuse me. So you have lots and lots of mostly young men in camps all over California, usually near stream beds or rivers. There's no women. There's no institutions. There's no sheriffs. There's no churches. There's no schools. There's no women to do the mending or the cooking. There's no mother to keep you in line. So the landscape and the societies that grew up in these places were raucous. This is a picture by Charles Knoll. I think you can see it in the Crockett Museum still. And you have this these array of activities. You do have the fellow in the center reading his Bible with a bunch of attentive men, but you also have the horse races and the drunken fellow on the side. And it's remote, and the cabins are made of logs, and there's not much in the way of society in this place. Now, when I say society, I use that word deliberately, because when one of the things that reformers wanted to do in California when they saw this was, God, my goodness, we need women. We need women here to civilize these young men. And by the way, to cook and clean and do all the labor that had been missing before. And so we have the missing part of the California story. These are the woman on my left, I guess it's your left too, is Georgiana Bruce Kirby. If anyone's read Angle of Repose, she is painted as a sour, brittle, angry woman in that book. If you read her actual biography, she is a remarkable educator who spent her whole life as a reformer throughout California. The picture on the bottom right kind of gives the myth that brought women, especially young women. There was a newspaper of the time called the Matrimonial Times. It was even more popular after the Civil War because there had been such a loss of men, marriageable men, that women looking to get married, young women, were looking west. And they advertised, much like any kind of ad today. And my favorite of these ads is, I'm fit, fat, and 45. The woman is saying, going to tell you exactly what you're getting. And I'm guessing she was snatched up. I don't know. But a lot of I use that example because the labor that women were providing was the very labor that they were doing for free in the East. One of these women, Lucina Wilson. Has anybody heard of Lucina Wilson before? She now does have a Wikipedia page. How accurate it is, I'm not sure. Lucina Wilson, 1820, when she was born, Quaker, a lady who married a man who decided in 1848 to leave her and her small children and go west to California. And she said, no, you are not leaving me. We are going with you. And she did. She went around over the Overland Trail, and upon arriving in California, in Sacramento, her husband went off and started digging in the dirt, and she set up a camp and started making biscuits for her family. Now, the myth is that while she's making biscuits for her family, a young tattered man wanders into camp and says to her, I'll pay you $5 for that biscuit, which is an exorbitant amount, a huge amount of money for biscuit. And so she's taken aback, which he interprets as a bargaining tool, and he raises that to $10. I'll give you $10 for that biscuit, which she sells him for $10, and gets the idea that the money to be made in California is not, in fact, to be made in gold. The money to be made in California is to be made off the backs of miners who have funds and who will pay for the thing that they actually need and is more precious, which is care, food, a place to stay. So she sets up one of the first boarding houses in Sacramento. When that burns down, she goes to Nevada City and sets up another, the first was a flood. She flooded out of Sacramento. She goes to Nevada City. She's burned out of Nevada City. She goes eventually to Vacaville and sets up a place. And amidst all of this entrepreneurial work, her husband's digging gold and making very, very little. And he eventually leaves her as she's setting up more and more of these places. But you're learning she's learning that the skills that she had provided for free are worth quite a bit of money. The number of women in the West who set up their own businesses, most of them boarding houses, we don't know the actual number. And one of the characters in my book is one of these women. In the East, women had one option if you wanted to own your own business, and that was a theater director. The theater was just above the brothel in terms of social, what people thought of you. So I should have had my own coffee. I'm spitting over my words, so I apologize for for tripping. I haven't done this in about 2 years. I practiced this morning and I thought, oh, I hadn't had it, but okay, the other way. Of course, there's another way. Kathy, what'd you say?
The women of ill repute.
The women of ill repute.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And if we are talking about how women make money, one of the oldest professions ever, and the one in which when I asked my students, why did you take my class? A lot of them said, well, we wanted to learn about the prostitutes in California during the gold rush, because the assumption was that if you were in California and you were a woman, then you were either a wife or a prostitute. And the sexual mores of the time suggest that women were all tied up and that sex was not something that anyone enjoyed in the Victorian era. The reality is much more complicated. Women did sell themselves for sex, but the rate was a tremendous, your value, we was on a tremendous scale. I'm gonna keep going on this because I want to go back to, where'd it go? I'm gonna go back to this picture right here on the top right. So if you're a prostitute in California, you might, if you were a madam, make $400 a night for the pleasure of some high-class man spending the night with you or one of your girls, which you then took $700 and took your $400 cut out of. However, these women in what are called cribs are most often Chinese girls who were sold into slavery, and they were sold for a rate of $1 a night, $1. And the life expectancy for these young girls was very short, several years at most. And they had no agency. They had no way of leaving. They were captives to one of the 5 families in San Francisco at the time. And while they were probably the lowest of the low in terms of how people are treated, there was a whole range from that $1 to the $400 rate of women selling sex, selling this thing that men had taken, that husbands had taken for granted in the East for years. So one person asked me, are you exaggerating the rate? And I thought so. And I've looked that up again and again, because that difference between $1, the rate and the value of someone's life, $1 or 400, just seems insane. But these were times when slavery was rampant, and I think you'd find the same kind of value put on various lives today. So our women of ill repute, this is probably a high-class brothel. If you've gone into San Francisco, there's a small side street off Union Square called Maiden Lane. Maiden Lane was where some of the high-class brothels existed. Any of the side streets that were then spidering off before the Great Fire, you might have found a lower class person, a cheaper night if you were a man. And as I say this, I realize I'm saying all of this through the eyes of men through history. I didn't even realize I was doing that. The other way to make money is to be an entertainer. At the time, a lady of the stage was only just above a lady of a brothel in terms of social respect. But you did have some notorious individuals, including Lola Montez, who was born in Ireland in 1821, notorious. Now, her original name was Eliza Rosanna Gilbert. She was born in County Sligo to a man who moved she and her mother to India and promptly died. When she was moved back to the UK, she went to several different relatives and schools until she eloped at 16 with a young lieutenant. and began to dance. Her first stage performance was not well received in London, but it was at that first stage performance that she called herself Lola Montez, the Spanish dancer. She was the queen of self-promotion. She understood the ins and outs of the spectacle of it and how to present herself in such a way that would garner both attention and no attention, negative or positive, was bad for her. When she went to Europe, she became the mistress of the king of Bavaria. I'm sorry. And the Bavarians were not very happy with their king cavorting with a stage actress. And they, after years of enduring her antics and her presence, and after he ceded the throne to his son, she fled to the United States, and in 1853 finally ended up in California. When she was in California, she saw rightly that she could make a lot of money very quickly on the stage. The picture on the left, excuse me, on the right, is of Lola's spider dance. And if we were in person, I would have props and do this for you. You're just gonna have to use your imagination. Okay, so imagine I'm dressed in many, many, many layers of clothing, and oh dear, I have discovered in the outer layer a spider. So I will strip that layer of clothing, I will dance to the left, I will dance to the right, and oh dear, I will discover another spider in another layer of clothing. And by the time she rids herself of all those burdensome spiders, she has also rid herself of many layers of clothing and earned the reputation of a excellent entertainer in a group and in a place that was mostly men who needed and desired this kind of entertainment. So she too was selling sex in her own way. She left California for the next gold rush in Australia, knowing that this is really the only place where her talents were going to be paid for. And she died quite young of syphilis in about 1860. Anybody heard of Mary Ellen Pleasance? Is that a name? She's a San Franciscan. She was known as City Hall, and she came, born in 1814, maybe into slavery, maybe not. She was a master of creating her own story, and she changed her story to suit her needs at any time. We do know that she she lived for many years up in Nantucket, where she was marginally educated, but mostly an indentured servant. She married a man named Pleasance, and they both worked for the Underground Railroad for years until she had to flee and ended up fleeing to California in about 1853. And when she was there, she established herself as a tremendous cook. And at the time, if you were a cook, you could make great money. So she was hired by some of the most powerful and richest men in San Francisco. She would serve them, but as she served them, she also collected secrets. She became known as the woman who knew everything and used this information to her advantage over the years and was quite smart investing, to the point where she was called Black City Hall in San Francisco. If you wanted something done, if you wanted a secret to be held, if you wanted to blackmail someone, if you wanted something pushed through the local city government, you talked to Mary Ellen Pleasance, whether you were Black or white. There was a huge number of rumors that rose up, including that she was a baby farmer, which probably, we don't know exactly, but probably meant she handled the illegitimate children of most of these very wealthy men. She went east for a time because she was a good friend of John Brown. And when he was planning to blow up and Harper's Ferry and a lot of that, she was integral in that whole process. She was also one of the first and largest donors for a small college called St. Mary's in California, which is now in Moraga. She was a $10,000 donor, which is a great deal of money at the time. So had her fingers in philanthropy of all kinds for years. The reason why she was called the civil rights, mother of civil rights, is that in the 1860s, the trolley cars in San Francisco were segregated. She sued the state of California and won, and desegregated the trolleys in California in the 1870s. And very few people know her name, although it's becoming more and more known. Sister Noon was a book that was written. Karen Joy Fowler has a novel about her. Cecile Bibbs is a woman in San Francisco who will transform herself and become Mary Ellen Pleasance in kind of a possession performance. It's remarkable to watch. And slowly people are learning more about her. The difficulty is many of the details and facts of Mary Ellen Pleasant's life, she was very careful to give you more conflicting information than you might need so that she could never be pinned down for anything that she might have done within San Francisco. And then the last person I'm going to talk about before we start talking about questions is Josefa Segovia. Now, this picture you may or may not recognize. She was the first woman hanged in California. She was called Juanita for many years, and the stories about why she was hanged differed depending on what record you listen to. The story that I tend to think carries the most weight, if only because it was repeated more often, was that she had been living with a man, Jose, in Rough and Ready. Is it Rough and Ready? I can't remember the town. In California, rural California. And it was a party night and the 4th of July, and people were shooting and having a great time. And a young man comes into her place and she stabs him, assuming probably rightly that he was going to rape her. The next morning, they decide that she is a murderess. They take her to without a trial and summarily hang her. The only reason why this probably made the news is because she was the first woman hung in California. There are other stories about why she was punished this way. There are stories that she went after the man the day after with a knife through the crowds, stabbed him in the back. This story seems to have been constructed by, I don't even know who the teller was, but there was only one of that account and several of the accounts where she was acting in self-defense. But she was a Mexican woman. Jose came up. She was probably living in San Diego, which had been Mexico. Her family was from that area, came up at the time and were completely inundated with European men who would not allow anybody of color a stake or a claim within the alluvial mining, and were relegating people to labor at the time. She was a cook, and very little is known beyond this stance that she took at the end. And I don't know anything about it except that the cross-like stance and the crucifix-like stance is something that was one of the things widely accepted about her death. There's a lot of books now that have been written. The first book that I found is the one on the top left, They Saw the Elephant. When I was first researching, it was the only book that had a wide account of several different women. Joanne Levy was not a professional historian, but like me, discovered that there had been no record, that they were left out of all of the W.S. Brand's Rushes for Riches and some of these well-known textbooks that had been written by men that had no notion of women. In Roaring Camp, the book over to the left, there is a picture of a androgynous-looking young man or a young woman dressed as a young man. It's about 3/4 of the way through this book. And it was a picture that sparked my interest in the main character of my first novel, named Alex, who's coming to this town dressed as a young man. All of these books I recommend, but let's go to questions, because that I'll give you this too, and as a kind of a guide if you want to read some of these books, some of the books that went into the research for the novel. But let's see, what questions do you have? And we can go from there. Kathy, I can't hear you.
There
you are.
So I kept thinking about when they did have marriages, then weren't there children? And so did anybody come on as a school teacher at any, or was that much later in the gold rush?
There were children. There were very few children. The first institutions that were established in California were jails. And the first jail was a floating jail off the near the peninsula where San Quentin now rests. There was a boat and they put their prisoners there. So isn't that telling that that was the first institution established. There were schools, and in fact, a woman named Eliza Farnham, who was also a matron of Sing Sing prison for years before coming west, she was determined to establish schools along with Georgiana Bruce Kirby, who was one of the women featured on one of the slides. They were reformers. They believed in the education of young girls, especially. Eliza Farnham was interesting because she not only believed that women were equal, but superior to men, and wrote many large, wordy books that would prove this with exhausting language. She actually lived in Santa Cruz, she and Bruce Kirby. And if you go to Santa Cruz, Georgiana Bruce Kirby's contribution to education is still there. One of the things in the 1863, was it, when St. Mary's was created, the clergy recognized the great need to civilize and educate these ruffians. A lot of the people who came west were not educated. And those that were had an immediate advantage because they could do jobs that weren't labor jobs. So schools weren't far behind the penitentiary. I don't know what that says. But neither were churches, and neither were all the institutions that a lot of people had hoped to leave behind in the East. One of the observations that people made was, here we are trying to escape all the strictures that had bound us in society. And what do we do but rebuild them at the first chance we get in another place, in another landscape.
I have another question.
Yeah, go for it.
In the Klondike gold rush, the people that really made the money were the people that set up stores.
Yeah.
People that, of course, sold horses, then died on the trail because they weren't in very good shape. But it much more than the miners, because by the time so many miners came, the rush really was over. So did women become shopkeepers as they created little towns out of these shacks?
They did. They, like Luzina Wilson, recognized very quickly that the tasks that they had done for free could make them money. There was a woman in Grass Valley known as Madame Mustache. She was known to have kept a tavern. They are not well recorded in history, but and the records that might have existed were destroyed in the many fires and many floods that swept through the landscape at the time, both because there were too many people, so fires were a result, and because the natural ecosystem of California includes fire and flood. And it's only our efforts in the last 100 years to kind of restrain both of those things that seem, that we haven't been living in that constant influx. It's returning, but the people who made money. There's a guy named Sam Brenna. I'm SAM Samuel Brenna in San Francisco. And for a while he was importing carpet. But carpet is heavy and it's expensive. And he discovered very quick that what he needed to import was carpet tacks, the little tacks that nailed carpet to the ground. because he knew that there was going to be so many fires that if he could corner the market on carpet tacks, he could make his fortune, and he did. So there were some very smart people who realized that it was not digging in the dirt that was going to get them rich. It was everything else, like you said, the shopkeepers, the mortuary folks, the brothel owners. Anybody who's going to sell you a shovel is going to make much, much more than the guy who's going to use it.
What about Chinese women? Like, is there any history of Chinese women coming over and gaining power and autonomy?
There's a woman named Ah Toy. Now, whether that's her real name, I don't know. She was a pretty infamous madam who had houses of girls. And so there were women who, Chinese women who had a little power, most of it through the five families and most of it through selling other women through sex. That there is, I can't imagine that there's not more research on that question, and that there must be someone who knows far more than I do about more individual voices at that time. Mostly young men coming from China, though. And they never intended to stay. They were going to go back from Gold Mountain. Didn't send my bones home from Gold Mountain. They did not want to stay. But they were treated very, very poorly, and any riches they might have gained were given to one of the five families for the transport over to the country in the first place. And then were lured west or north by the railroads, and they never intended to stay. There was not that same impulse that the white and the European people seemed to feel. And that impulse didn't come until the 1856 and after. One of the things that happened is that women like Madame Mustache, for example, who had tremendous power in the gold rush by having jobs that sold men various conveniences that they had in the East, lost a lot of their social power when women started to come in mass, because they brought with them a lot of the social strictures that those women had escaped in the East. But I don't know enough about Chinese women.
And you're talking about the five families. Would we recognize those names by like street names or San Francisco history? Like, who were the five families?
I don't know. I don't know enough about them. I don't have them in my notes at hand. One of the professors at St. Mary's does a presentation on the five families. You can go on walking tours in San Francisco that will take you on historical landscapes throughout, that will know more about the specific families. It's not something that I had in the research for the novel. What I had is the tremendous difficulty Chinese people had in fitting into society. My main character in Crown of Dust is in love with a Black man, and she has no problem with this relationship. She does. She knows that it's not accepted. But a woman who loves a Black man can also be tremendously racist against the Chinese men that come in when the gold is discovered into her town. It was not a welcoming landscape, although the labor of Chinese Americans built the West, built the railroads, built a lot of the landscapes that we see, or a lot of the industry. It's a good question. And that's like call to action. Either you or me needs to find out more about those things. Sometimes I think if I had been an academic, there would be no end to the research you could do and to the omissions that exist in history.
Mm. So is I can't remember her name in Crown of Dust, but the female character, is she modeled after Madame Mustache?
She wasn't. I have a character in this book named Emmeline, and she I did not discover Madame Mustache until after I had written and published the book. And it was remarkable because if you look through some of the magazines and some of the newspapers, she's there. but I hadn't seen her until I read a book by David Comstock about brides of the California, and it's just one line in there about Madame Mustache.
Huh.
So, maybe she was speaking to me beyond. I don't know. She may not have liked how I portrayed her. I don't know. Any other questions? One gold rush is a lot like another. One of the things I learned reading about this time and other places where rushes were happening was that you had this huge influx of men without much social structure, of vigilantism as a kind of organizing feature of those societies. At first, you had very little crime because everyone was working on their own. They were helping each other or they died. And then as society comes back in and the towns get built up around them, and as the gold diminishes and the industry grows, a lot of the freedoms that they sought in the first search were lost, but a lot of the comforts were returned. And it was a cycle that happened all over the world at the time. And also happening all over the world at the time was the mass genocide of indigenous people who had lived in those areas at the time of discovery. So the notion that history repeats is eerily true. Mark Twain would say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I like that phrase. Why don't I read? So I got into this research because I had no idea what I was doing as a lecturer, and I discovered in the research voices of women. And it was the voices that led me deeper into the discovery of the history, not the other way around. So I want to read you the first voice that came to me when I was writing this book, and the landscape that came as a result of having lived there and having been very homesick and looking back 150 years, gave rise to this voice. So I'm just going to read you the first bit of this story, and then see if any other questions, and then we'll. This is helpful, by the way. I see a lot of holes that I could fill in this presentation now, having done this once. But this is Emmeline. This is the woman with the mustache, who I had no idea actually existed. She must have been speaking from beyond the grave. Emmeline searches the sky for storm clouds from the doorway of the Victoria Inn. The man snoring at her feet grunts, rolls over, and curls himself around an upturned bottle of whiskey. She picks up her skirt, steps over him onto the porch. Can't predict the weather this time of year. Fools even the wildflowers. Mistake 3 days of sunshine for the start of May, when one hard freeze will snap the petals right off and kill the early batch of mosquitoes already swarming. Across the road, the chapel's canvas roof sags like wet clothes on a line. It won't take another snow like the last. Klein promised to fix the damn thing, but he's probably knee-deep in the creek with the rest of them. It's no wonder nobody in these parts has struck pay dirt yet, what with their canvas tents and frame cabins, so easy to desert. Why would the earth give up its gold just to be abandoned on rumor of another strike? The soil is a shrewd old whore and has learned better than to give her gold for free. A person should have a solid foundation, Emmeline always says, some sort of permanence in her life, a place for luck to grow. That's why she's insisting on having the chapel finished. Nothing establishes a place like inviting God to stay. She imagines a tidy steeple with a sensible wooden cross, simple oak pulpit, and rows of sober pews. No stained glass, no gaudy ornamentation, save that for the Baptists to mistake the sound of their own voices for the word of God. Behind the chapel, she imagines a cemetery with graves surrounded by white picket fences to keep souls from drifting. Emmeline is tired of drifting. That's how she thinks of it. not pioneering, certainly not running, but drifting. True, Motherlode isn't much to look at, not yet, but she has a feeling about the place. Call it intuition. The ravine walls stand at attention on either side of her valley, and the cedars that brush the rim are a feathered fringe in the glare of the afternoon sun. A movement up the road catches her eye. She squints to see better. Preacher, she says. The man at her feet grunts but doesn't move. Emmeline nudges him with her toe. John! She kicks him harder. Another grunt. God damn it, John, wake your sorry ass up and look down the road. She reaches under him with her toe, lifts with all her might, and John rolls sideways down the steps to land in a stupor at the bottom. A stocky black man steps out of the building behind her and stares in the direction of Emmeline's gaze. It ain't no one but Randall, missus, and his mule. I can see who it is, Jed. But her shoulders slump and she lets out a breath, slowly, hoping Jed won't notice. And don't be calling me no missus. Jed crosses his arms in front of him and places his hand to his chin, a common posture for him. It's hard to tell whether he's deep in thought or simply hiding a smile. Emmeline sits down, knees apart on the steps above Preacher John and glares back at Jed. Whatever you say, Miss Emmeline, he says, retreating into the building just as another, smaller figure appears around the mass of manzanita, marking the edge of Motherlode. And that smaller figure is the arrival of Alex. Alex is a young woman, dressed as a young boy, on the run from something that you discover later in the book. And the story really is about two women in a ramshackle town full of men. One of the women is disguised and has some freedom as a man that she never enjoyed as a woman before. And it's looking at the boom and bust of this tiny place that now probably is a street name, like the many street names in Grass Valley, You Bet, and Frenchman's Flat, and all of these places that had existed as tiny little communities based around this search for gold, and that no longer exist, except in the memories of a few local historians, of which I'm grateful to for remembering all of those details. Any other questions?
Just a comment. When I read your book, The Crown of Dust, I didn't realize that the main character was a woman dressed as a man. It took me a while to catch on to that.
It took Emmeline a while too. I had, at first I had omitted that. I tried to write it so that the reader wouldn't know either. But it was actually a lot more fun knowing that Alex was a woman throughout, especially when she takes the nugget she finds and puts it in a place where no one would look,
Right.
but where everyone expected there to be a bulge, and there was some fun to be had with penis jokes, I guess, that I couldn't resist.
No bulges.
Go ahead, Nancy.
No, I say no bulges.
No. Also, the other thing about Gold Rush history and history in general is when you look at the records, you do see homosexual relationships. You do see interracial relationships. They are in the record. They are there. They're not in the history books. But when you look back through some of the cargo ship hold records and you find reference to the boom boom trade and you say, oh, what's the boom boom trade? And you start looking, you realize that, oh, okay. The boom boom trade was the sexual happenings between men, both in California, in these camps where they very often cross-dressed, and one young man would act as the woman at the dances, and several, and on ships where one of the main characters, David, has crossed and is certain that he's in love with a young man. Now, whether that happened right in that location, I don't know. But there were lots of records, and there are more and more records between women and themselves, blue stocking women who found love even if they didn't find physical intimacy between women and between equals.
Okay.
Joyce, did you have a question?
I was going to ask about the children. I mean, all this, you
Yeah.
had men, you had women. We didn't talk about children. They must have had a high mortality rate there, but and maybe they just didn't have children, but they must have, because the generations continued.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the mortality rates. It was high all over the world at the time. I don't know a lot about it. I don't know. I know there weren't a lot of children in California in those landscapes until about the 60s and 70s. You started to see when the women came west, so did the children. And Luzina Wilson came with her 2 children. That they weren't mentioned doesn't mean that they didn't have long lives after. I don't know. I don't know what happened to them.
They probably just
Josiah
did-
Royce, who
Yes.
was a well-known philosopher in Harvard, he grew up in Grass Valley and writes a lot about it. And when he was, when his mother was getting older, he had her write her memoirs. So A Gentlewoman in the Far West was the result of that. It's a really interesting book because unlike some of the books that like the Shirley letters, which were written at the time and sent east, and are raw and are not reflective at all. they're kind of they're written for the shock and the surprise. The Royce, the Woman in the Far West, is very reflective, and it's a religious reminiscence of the journey, all told with kind of a biblical allegory overlaid. But that's told 45 years after the event itself. And so that she's colored all of the loss that she experienced and all the hardship in almost a mythic biblical tone. It's a beautiful book. But it shows you the difference between an event recounted in an instant and an event remembered years and years later, and at least in that circumstance. But she doesn't say much about her children in that book either. Loss was a fact of life. Many women lost children. You were more likely to I don't know the statistics, but loss was a huge part of having children at the time.
But it wasn't family focused. It was activity focused or history focused. So it probably didn't matter about the children. It was just an interesting point that wasn't very explained.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the children. I should ask, because Grass Valley has a great history section. So if I wanted to go find out about the first schools, I'm sure it would be right there at the Madeline and Helling Library in downtown Nevada City. I could find it for you.
That's okay. It's not that big a point. It was just another aspect that was missing or not. But what you did was great. You did a great job, and it was fascinating. Thank you.
Well, the call to action, right? What's left out? It might be completely obvious. I think if I had given like a cleaner presentation, it wouldn't be as obvious what's left out. So maybe it serves my purpose to stumble and stutter a little bit, because the omissions are many, and there's lots to know about the voices that weren't mentioned. But that's one of the pleasures of novel writing and of history, is that there's always another story. There's always another angle on the same story. Scripture is interesting like that too. I'm only recently discovering that.
Yeah. Well, you told me a lot of things I didn't know about before, so it didn't seem like you were stuttering and stumbling.
It's probably, when you drink, there's like a perfect amount of coffee, not too much and not too little. I think I just tipped over the top of a little too much. You get a little bit jittery as a result. I made a lot of mistakes in the research. for this book. I had no idea what I was doing. I was 22 years old. I was an English major, and really I was a basketball major in college. And so when I came out, I didn't know what I was doing. And in fact, the last edit in Crown of Dust, I discovered this. My editors in England had no idea. I'd put the Mississippi River on the wrong side of Missouri. It was one line. And I'm guessing the editor thought I knew what I was talking about, but she probably lived as close to the Mississippi River as I did in California. So I found that, and that omission, that mistake, made me completely obsessed with the Mississippi River. And that led to my second novel, Reliance, Illinois, which is set on the Mississippi River 10 years after the American Civil War. And it led me to read everything that Mark Twain wrote about the river and discover how the river's changed since 1811, when the New Madrid earthquake changed the direction and made the Mississippi River double back on itself, to now, when it's so altered by the Army Corps of Engineers that the flooding that happens still happens. It just happens in mass in other parts of the river. But so, you got to roll with those mistakes, I guess. I'm glad I caught it though. Can you imagine?
Generative.
I guess I should mention that Orinda Books has my books if you want to check out either one of them. And I'll send, how do I do that? How do I'll email you the reading list just in case you want to read more about the time.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And I'll send the video to whoever wants it. Or make another one of the two. All right. If there's no questions, and that doesn't mean you can't, if you have a burning question, that's or later if you want to email me a question. If I don't know the answer, I'll just find out.
That's delightful.
It was a lot of fun. I loved learning all of this and relearning it too after time, because when you go back through the record now, there's so much more information about each of these women than there had been just 10 years ago or 10 years before that. Virginia Woolf has a statement that the history of women is hidden away in cabinets and old drawers and in journals. And I think that's true. I think if you ever have or any of these documents, great aunt so-and-so, those are valuable. The things that she wrote down and noticed and recognized at the time, historians are finally recognizing the value in those objects, even though they weren't to do with war always, or death or conquest. Okay, well, thank you for your time. Thank you, and for donating to OOC. If you want to donate more, please do. Be my guest. And you can email me anytime. It'll be my pleasure to answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Mwah. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Trey. Bye, Trey.
Bye.
Nancy, nice to meet you.